First, I just want to thank all of the people here at Tudor Place and the broader community. We really met because about a year and a half ago, we realized that many of us who work at historic sites, and they're each quite different, were doing history that wasn't always easy to do, both to do the research, but also to tell the stories. And so we met actually just under a year ago, and actually for the first time shared our histories with each other. And I think this is one of those events that came out of that. So it's been really a pleasure to be part of this community. All right, there we go. So I want to begin by acknowledging that long prior to European occupation and through today and tomorrow, Indigenous peoples have stewarded the lands and waters of the American continent. I live and study and labor on the lands and waters that we know as the Potomac Valley, the ancestral and homelands for thousands of years to the present day of communities including the Algonquin, Iroquois, and Siouan peoples alongside the Piscataway Confederacy and communities. The community of Dumbarton Oaks, our scholars, and all those with whom we work respect this long history of this place. In this lecture today, and it's really more of a talk, I will keep my notes so I keep myself on track, but I'm really looking forward to question. I'm sharing a work in progress. History, I would argue, as a historian, is always in progress. We're always understanding more fully. It's a history telling in the making, as it were. It's a part of a larger effort to respond to a critical call today to understand and share more truthful, as in full of truth, histories of our places. While at Dumbarton Oaks, we have supported scholars of garden, landscape, and place histories for over 75 years. It is only in the last 5+ years that we've sought to uncover a more complex histories of our place, landscape, and gardens before the Blisses created that remarkable Center for the Humanities. They didn't, in fact, find a void. They found a place. This work has particularly been inspired by our own leadership of the Democracy and Landscape Initiative funded by the Mellon Foundation. So I want to thank them for their help as well. Gardens as a work of art. At Dumbarton Oaks today, we honor the role of Mildred and Robert Bliss as the patrons of this Center for the Humanities with 3 areas of study: Byzantine studies, pre-Columbian studies, and garden and landscape studies. And we just welcomed this year's cohort just last week of fellows, about 45 fellows with us this year. Established as a Center for Research in the Humanities in 1940 and given to Harvard University to steward because at that time in 1940 and 41, they could not imagine a time where the humanities were more dire. I might suggest that we have returned to that time. We care and draw from the collections, the Byzantine and pre-Columbian art and collections, and the garden book and manuscripts, as well as the garden as a work of art designed by Beatrix Farren between 1921 and 1947. Today, the garden defines what most visitors and scholars think of as the Dumbarton Oaks landscape. And in this, we celebrate and honor the history of Farren's design, an important contribution to the history of landscape architecture as a profession, and that of the gardens as a work of art and really truly part of the collections. But it is also a landscape that is comprised of layers of history. And in this way, my talk tonight is really about the land as an archive, offering a thick history of place. Because as a historian, I must also, as does the Tudor Place, consider how we steward this place into the future. What stories do we tell, and how do we come to understand the changing relationships to place that this land might reveal, from histories of thriving to histories of violence to histories of climate adaptation, to just name some. Farren's design and cultivation of this site in collaboration with gardeners, horticulturalists, and artists, as well as Robert and Mildred Bliss, created a place that is recognized internationally as a beautiful garden and place. In some places the most beautiful, some places in the top 10. I think we can agree it's pretty gorgeous. But what's particularly interesting to me to think about, and I should note these are all photographs by Sahar Colston Hardy, a photographer out of Philadelphia. What is particularly remarkable to me about this design these are probably images that you can imagine taking yourself, is that Farren really worked with the land She worked with what she found. She worked with the topography in place, as was taught to her by Charles Sprague Sargent, who led the Arnold Arboretum and was her mentor early on when she decided to go from being an opera singer to a landscape garden designer. And one of the things he told her was to always make the design fit the site. Don't make the site fit your design. And she did that. But unbeknownst to her, because she did that, she actually protected the archival layers of the landscape. And today we can recognize those layers that we are responsible for as not just the integrity of Farron's design, but that of the land itself and its long history. So how do we acknowledge and build knowledge of land as a historical tapestry is what I would call it, a thick, almost a shag ruggy tapestry. We cannot follow what might be recognized in traditional practices of conservation and preservation. Any of you are involved in garden and landscape preservation, I say that with big air quotes. Landscapes, land and water and plants and life are far too dynamic for any approach that seeks to freeze, stop, or conserve a moment in time. This garden doesn't look the same this evening as it did yesterday in the sun. And further, in our focus on periods of significance, we often ignore the land as a thick and messy archive that does not distinguish between periods or eras, and certainly not between moments of ownership. The land doesn't really care. In place, we must hold space for multiple, often conflicting and counter narratives and memories. And in this vein, I have worked with a group of students over the last 5.5, 6 years to research a longer history of the place we know as Dumbarton Oaks, and then to consider the various ways that we might share it with our communities. In this work, I seek to be in relationship to and discussion with the Piscataway community, including Gabrielle Tayak. So this is a plug to come back and see her October 7th. Fantastic scholar and person, who's part of the Piscataway community on whose kinland and ancestral land we sit at this moment. And with the descendants of the enslaved who shaped the land and labored the land that we know. And the visitors who have come to admire the garden as a work of art, as a place of respite, and as a place of beauty. This work I've come to call The Land as Archive, which became actually an exhibit in 2024, sadly gone. That's the problem with exhibits. They come, they go. But it's really was the first time that we did a large exhibit around this history. And I chose to call it The Land as Archive, centering on 3 ways of reading land and place: as witness, as ancestor, and as property. So Land as Archive explores the layers of history that comprise the landscape and gardens of Dumbarton Oaks, offering the opportunity to read the land as a collection of historical narratives and embedded knowledge. Land as Witness shares the stories of trees described as witnesses to the place of long sweeps of time, or what I've come to call tree time. Land as Ancestor honors this place as Piscataway homelands and ancestral lands from time immemorial through the present and future. And then Land as Property interrogates the claiming of property by settler colonialists who sought to create a new democratic nation while relying on the taking of indigenous lands and the use of enslaved labor to work the land. These are all stories that take place in the same place. So let's start with Land as Witness, what I might call the longue durée, tree time, long time. Indigenous communities lived in relationship to the land we know as Georgetown and Washington City in the District of Columbia for thousands upon thousands of years and remain here today. Nevertheless, the tract that we know as Dumbarton Oaks was claimed and deeded to Ninian Bell in 1703, and then shaped by enslaved labor and plantation owners, and only then by a series of estate owners and patrons with landscape architects such as Beatrix Farron. A history of Dumbarton Oaks centering the trees underscores how human and ecological histories have been braided together in this very place. Ancient trees have long been understood as ancestors and kin by indigenous peoples, and their long lifespans mean that they often bear witness to generations of human history. The lives of trees unfold in tree time, and attending to these lives necessitates a shift away from Western androcentric and teleological narratives of progress, i.e. history that depends on our own generations, which are relatively short compared to trees. Trees live, many of them, for hundreds, some thousands of years. Tree time is both hyperlocal and global, reflecting the circulation of plants between hemispheres and their rootedness in very particular places. The land of Dumbarton Oaks preserves these histories in a living archive of living witnesses, our trees. Many of the trees at Dumbarton Oaks today thrived in the region long before Eastern and Western hemispheres came into contact. These native trees, including among others the silver maple, the Osage orange, which you can actually track across the country, watch settlers moving by the movement of the Osage orange, the American beech, the tulip poplar, the white oak, and the eastern red cedar, witnessed the arrival of European settlers in the 1600s. Each of these species has also played a unique role in the local ecosystem and within the cultures of the indigenous peoples, serving a variety of material and spiritual purposes. The Columbia Exchange on the right refers to the biological globalization initiated by transatlantic voyages and trade beginning in the late 15th century. And trees were among the many species that began to travel between what we call the Old World and the New World in the early modern period. This is on the right is, by the way, an amazing map made by Charles Sprague Sargent, Farron's mentor, trying to look at native trees across the country and where there were masses. The giant tulip poplar, Liriodendron tulipifera, likely sprouted on our land in the 1600s through the early, maybe 1700s. Tulip poplars are native to North America, and the Piscataway people refer to them as canoe trees because their fine hardwood and straight, long trunk is ideal for shaping really long, beautiful canoes. Nearby, next door to Dumbarton Oaks and across the street, essentially from here in Montrose Park, with a crown spread of more than 100 feet, one champion tulip tree is one of the largest and most significant specimens in our region. In 1908, this tulip poplar would have witnessed the death of Barbara E. Pope, a local civil rights activist known for her opposing Virginia's Jim Crow law on an interstate trolley train nearly 50 years before Rosa Parks' pivotal role in the Montgomery bus boycott. Pope's body was discovered hanging in Lover's Lane soon after the Supreme Court of the District of Columbia found in Barbara Pope's favor, awarding her a penny in damages. The Historic American Landscape Survey confers witness protection status on trees that have, quote, experienced important events in American history and remain part of our nation's cultural history, i.e., if only trees could talk. With Jim Crow at the turn of the century, at least 4,075 racial terror lynchings were reported in the United States, including 112 in Virginia and Maryland. Many of these victims of this violence were hung from trees. Though hanging trees are memorialized in some regions, more often than not, trees conscripted into incidences of racial terror must be counted among our country's most important unmarked witnesses. The trees cultivated by the Piscataway included the oaks and tulip trees, and they are some of our most magnificent trees within the Dumbarton Oaks garden. But there were others that were added by the various property owners, the Beverleys, the Robert Beverly family who built the Orangerie and were some of the largest family of slave traders in the Commonwealth of Virginia, John C. Calhoun, Vice President of the United States, and he was at Dumbarton Oaks when he was writing the Indian Removal Act and defending slavery, and the Lithicums, a tree salesman that I'll refer to later. Each sought to create a garden on this land, a country estate in a city of power. The oldest tree at Dumbarton Oaks is that one there. It is a large white oak, Quercus alba, by the Ribbon Walk, likely began its life in the very early 18th century, if not the end of the 17th century. This 300-year-old plus tree witnessed the construction of the main house in 1801 and still sits dangerously close to the house. And we will not cut it down. When Edward Linthicum purchased Dumbarton Oaks in 1846, he named the property the Oaks after the numerous oak trees, but particularly that grand one that once thrived on the slope of the present-day South Lawn. Mildred and Robert Woods Bliss would change the estate name to Dumbarton Oaks in 1933, also honoring these oak trees, which I have to say, it's at the moment we're losing them due to climate change. It's getting too warm for the white oaks, which is truly sad for those who love these incredible trees. The Yulon magnolia, Magnolia denudata, many of you may know it. It's what we call the bride out in front of the orangery. It's native to the eastern and southern China and was the first magnolia species introduced from Asia to the Western world. It arrived during a 19th century horticultural boom in the US, roughly 1850 to 1880, when the country's nursery and seed dealing businesses exploded, enabling the introduction of many new ornamental varieties from Asia and around the globe. And Linthicum, along with Pierce and Pierce Mill, was an important person in that trade. So that's what we call the bride, Magnolia denudata, probably planted in the 1890s, maybe late 1880s. We also have the Katsura tree here. The Katsura tree, Sursodiphyllum japonicum, was introduced to North America from its native Japan in the 1860s, around 1867. Dumbarton Oaks has been home to a magnificent Katsura tree for at least 130 years. So it wasn't the first Katsura, which I'd hoped to be able to show. But it's certainly one of the first few Katsuras brought over from Japan and planted on the East Lawn, where it borders our street, belonging to the first wave of Katsuras from Japan. In 1944, the Katsura witnessed the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, a series of critical diplomatic meetings that took place at the height of World War II and established the foundation elements of the United Nations Charter that we know today. That happened in the music room. But actually, I think the most important discussions happened in the garden. These are just some of the narratives that we can share if we think about the history of the place through the lens of trees and literally the land, what those trees could say if they had heard the diplomats, although I suppose they wouldn't have talked as much if they knew the trees could talk. Land as ancestor is a different kind of time. Based on relationships to land and place, this is another narrative, a different reading of time, what we might call indigenous time. The property of Dumbarton Oaks and the surrounding region is indigenous ancestral territory and Piscataway homelands, really to the Piscataway Confederacy, so including a number of communities. Prior to European occupation, a tribe of Algonquin-speaking people allied with the Piscataway Confederacy and were the primary stewards of present-day Georgetown and Washington, D.C. The communities in this place were known by settler colonists as the Anacostan or Nacotchtank, after the name of their major trading center. Living at the confluence of the Potomac and the Anacostia rivers, which obviously we have renamed, they connected tidewater societies to inland tribes. Despite their commercial and political importance, the colonial records suggest they disappear in the 1700s. But in fact, indigenous life has never stopped and today persists, as you'll hear from Gabi, I'm sure. Dumbarton Oaks was once the crossing land, a place of two ridges, a north-south ridge and an east-west ridge, a place of hunting, traveling, and meeting in the woods, along the streams, and across the valleys. It was the land of the Algonquin and Iroquoian communities alongside the Piscataway. This is where history really begins, if not in the geology. And here we can actually read an origin story that they shared in the 17th century as another layer of land and land as archive. This is Piscataway land, homeland. It is here that they lived in towns and villages and where they practice an agriculture of interplanting practices, as well as hunting, fishing, gathering, and trapping. They manage forests and river ecosystems with a complex, sustainable, and integrated economy. They quarried for quartzite and soapstone, and you can see some of those places along Rock Creek, used extensively both by their communities and as a trading item inland. Sites such as the village of Nacotchtank served as fishing and trading centers on the Potomac. The Piscataway Confederacy included many villages and communities. Leadership was based in what today we call Accokeek, Maryland. In 1608, however, in 1608, John Smith recorded Piscataway and other settlements, such as Nacotchtank, during his travels up the Chesapeake River. However, his map doesn't even begin to capture the sophisticated network of tribal relations and omits indigenous cities whose populations had been temporarily reduced as residents were engaged with fishing and hunting elsewhere. It is yet an incomplete map of the area, and yet still dense. Piscataway communities were also critical intermediaries between Algonquin-speaking people on the shore and inland Iroquois-speaking nations. This position on the fall line put them at the center of trade in beaver pelts and commodities, giving them distinct diplomatic and commercial advantages. In the late 17th century, Tyaks, which is their term for what we might call a chief or a leader, such as Kittamakund, who had shared that origin story, leveraged access to pelts in negotiations with colonists who supplied furs to European hat markets. Trade and travel were conducted along what we know as Wisconsin Avenue, which would later be used by settlers. Georgetown, more broadly, was also a place where treaties were signed and later broken. Under this mulberry tree, this reads, on April 10th, 1666, Leonard Calvert made a treaty with the Indians of the village, end of quote. And while for the Nacotchtank, this was a place of trade, it was the same place from which they were relocated and eventually displaced, taken away from their ancestral lands. Although the land was claimed by the Duke of Baltimore and deeded to Ninian Bell, Piscataway communities maintained connections to the land long after 1703, and in fact, to this day. In fact, they just recently came and blessed our tulip poplars, which they consider part of their kin. The ridge and valley served not only as hunting grounds, but ritual lands where the land marks the crossing of the two ridges, descending to a tributary creek and eventually, as you know, into Rock Creek. While colonists claimed ownership, they did not inhabit the land in the same way as the indigenous communities. In 2012, after generations of indigenous activists working, Maryland recognized the Piscataway Indian Nation and the Piscataway Kahnoi tribe as official state tribes. The executive order symbolically confirmed an enduring cultural heritage while materially supporting indigenous communities by increasing access to federal funds and other resources. And in fact, there's Gabi. There's the other push. Gabi Tayak, I should say. Okay. In 1961, we saw the establishment of Piscataway Park in Accokeek, Maryland, and its 1968 expansion formalized the relationship between the Piscataway and their land that they had actually held for centuries. Visitors to Park today can learn how indigenous land use practices inform our understanding of the region, and initiatives led by the Accokeek Foundation demonstrate how Maryland and DC were and remain important places in Piscataway narrative. And they are exploring today with us how to bring them back onto the land of Dumbarton Oaks. Land is property, a sense of owning time, owning land, and owning people. Histories of the Dumbarton Oaks landscape are traditionally understood as an archive of property and capital. Who bought and sold this land? What buildings did they construct? Which plants did they import? And how many people did they enslave? There are always gaps in the holdings of a traditional archive, but the record of property deeds regarding Dumbarton Oaks land is notably consistent. These deeds tell us that this property continuously passed between the hands of enslavers from 1703 to 1862, when slavery was legally ended in DC. Thus, a significant part of the 18th and 19th century of this history of this property is that many of the enslaved people who lived and labored here, humans who were deemed property themselves, and who built and maintained this country house in the city, shaped the very land that we walk on today. Although the exhibit was focused on this particular scope, we all know here that this story stretches outward, whether to Tudor Place, to all Mount Vernon, and to our whole region, Monticello, Montpelier, etc., intertwining particularly with the broader Black history of Georgetown and into the present. In November of 1703, this is probably a story many of you know, but I think it's important to recognize, former indentured servant and colonial military leader Ninian Bell patented the land that would eventually become Georgetown, much of Georgetown and Dumbarton Oaks. His petition was granted by the Maryland Assembly for 795 acres. An indentured servant was supposed to get 50 acres. Beale called this land the Rock of Dumbarton. It was deeded to Ninian Bell 795 acres in recognition of his role as the chief of the Rangers, a group that killed Indians to keep land for settlers. Essentially, he was awarded that land as a reward for murdering Native Americans on their own homeland. In addition to the land, Beale was awarded 3 enslaved African laborers, John, Sarah, and Elizabeth, again for his military service against indigenous people who had originally occupied the region. And there is still to this day this plaque that notes this exchange. On March 10, 1706, Ninian and his wife Ruth made deeds of gifts of enslaved children to several of their children. And you can read that today in the archives of Ninian Bell. With the formation of Georgetown in 1751 and the District of Columbia in 1790, much of the land was taken away from the Bell family and more settlers arrived, and the community that we know today began to truly be formed. In 1801, the younger George Beale sold what would become Dumbarton Oaks to a plantation owner by the name of William Dorsey, a local lawyer and Maryland landholder, to build a country house in the city. He bought 22 acres and brought 10 enslaved individuals to the land. It should be noted at that time in this area, 4 enslaved was an average for the family. In fact, Dorsey's plantations and his iron forge included at least 122 enslaved individuals. So this was a fairly wealthy man with an extensive ownership. Enslaved labor built the first house, the brick 2-story house, spacious house, and its gardens, where we know that there were grown carnations, peas, and potatoes. In 1805, Robert Beverly of the Y Plantation on the Eastern Shore and of the Commonwealth of Virginia bought this property as yet another plantation, again, a country house in the city of Power. He renamed it Acrolofus, or the Grove on the Hill. Already a plantation owner, he moved enslaved people from his plantations in Virginia and Eastern Maryland and brought them to labor on this new property and to create gardens that were appropriate for his standing in society. Owning a large property without the need to exploit it for production was only possible because they had the wealth built on enslaved productive labor elsewhere. And the only thing that seems at all productive at this point was the apple orchard, which actually was probably in the same place the apple orchard is today. Robert Beverly built the Orangerie, a place that has its own history with plants, a place of botanical interest, collections, leisure, and probably one of the more beautiful buildings on the site. And you can see it over there on the far. I'm sure many of you have been inside it with the beautiful ficus vine. It's important to understand this place in context. So we note that in 1816, approximately 125 free and enslaved Black Georgetown residents founded what came to be known as Mount Zion United Methodist Church, the oldest Black congregation in DC. So there's a significant community here who thrived and persevered. Yarrow Mahmoud was a significant Georgetown resident, a formerly enslaved African and practicing Muslim. He had saved enough money to buy his own freedom, bought property on Dent Place, among other financial successes, and was in fact the subject of 2 formal portraits, the first by Charles Beale in 1819, and then later by James Alexander Simpson. In 1822, now you have to listen really carefully to A's and O's in this. So James Colquhoun purchased this property known as Oakley at the time on behalf of his mother, Floride Bonon Colquhoun. John C. Calhoun, notorious proponent of slavery and indigenous removal, married James Colquhoun's sister, Floride Bonon Colquhoun. and lived at DO while serving as Secretary of War and Vice President of the United States. Enslaved individuals lived and worked on the property, including those who were moved between the Colquhoun plantations, such as Fort Hill in South Carolina, which became Clemson University, while Calhoun also claimed 70 to 80 enslaved African Americans across his plantations in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. In 1838, Georgetown University's Jesuits sold 272 enslaved individuals, now often referred to as the GU 272, to Southern plantations to pay for the construction of the college and save the school from mounting debt. So you can start to understand the context that Colquhoun and the Calhouns are both in. In 1846, Edward Linthicum bought the property and renamed it the Oaks. He was a Georgetown resident who owned a hardware store where he sold trees and plants. He's actually the first non-plantation owner to buy the property after 1703. He relied on enslaved people to run his store and held at least 5 enslaved people on the property of Dumbarton Oaks, who likely worked in the orchard, tended the horses and at least 1 cow, and grew Irish potatoes and hay, as well as a market garden and apples in the orchard. Additionally, Linthicum employed free white laborers and oversaw renovations to the landscape, including hiring an English landscape designer by the name of J.H. Small, who likely worked with an enslaved gardener to create the gardens that became a showpiece in the neighborhood. And it was under him that the ficus vine in the orangerie was planted. So that was planted about 1859. And as many of you probably know, that is all one plant planted by one enslaved gardener. It was a very new plant from Asia. And so he would have had a lot of horticultural knowledge. You wouldn't just give anybody an exotic plant that spent 6 months on a boat. You gave it to somebody who knew how to thrive. Now, whether he imagined one day it would encompass the whole orangerie, who knows? Maybe he had a good imagination. Slavery in the District of Columbia would be legally ended, as you know, on April 16th, 1862, with the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act, freeing 3,100 individuals while reimbursing the enslavers. D.C. was the only place in the U.S. to implement compensated emancipation. So with that, and we can see here that Edward Linthicum, in fact, got $1,730.10 for these individuals. And those were the ones just at Dumbarton Oaks. Those are not actually the ones that were also at his hardware store. That is a different story. So those are the big stories of Dumbarton Oaks. What we also wanted to do was what I call more of a micro history, going from the big history to the actual lives of individuals. And so we chose a place in the garden, the Catalog House. It's a building that Beatrix Farron and Mildred Bliss had imagined you would come to as a visitor to learn about the garden. I don't know this, but I think that what they imagined is you would enter the garden from the Dumbarton Oaks Park and come up the hill through the garden. For also security reasons, Harvard would never do that. But I think that's why that Catalog House was right there at that bottom. And now it feels like it's at the back of the garden, but I think it was intended to be at the front. And here, what we have is an exhibit done by, overseen by me, but by a student, Kyra Marsh, that explores how from 1703 to 1862, numerous enslaved men, women, and children were forced to build, maintain, and steward the landscape. This exhibit highlights the stories of individuals owned by the Beverly family. I should note the Beverly family is the same family that owned Y Plantation, where Frederick Douglass grew up in Eastern Maryland. They were on this property from 1805 to 1823. Griffin, Otway, Celia, Kissia, and Dick were among the many enslaved people who would have beautified the gardens, found respite under the trees, cooked food in the main house, built or repaired the structures currently on the land, and even planted seeds of freedom that would be successful in one case and a failure in another. While research is ongoing and the archival material is scattered, Bound by the Beverleys aims to amplify what is currently known about those who were enslaved while the Beverleys owned the property. The exhibit was the first public opportunity for Dumbarton Oaks to speak their names, tell their stories, and shift our ideas of what this land was, is, and could be. On March 19, 1793, Virginia planter Robert Beverly Sr. bequeathed 94 enslaved people and their increase or future children to his wife, Maria Carter Beverly, who had come to live at Dumbarton Oaks. This included 22 men, 22 women, this is his list, 3 men servants, 6 women servants, 2 carpenters, 2 gardeners, 2 cooks, Agatha the weaver, Charity and her increase, and 30 children under the age of 15, and 25 individuals who'd be sold to Beverly's children. This is an art work that Daniel West Foster did to represent these people because we don't have images of them, but we want to honor all of them. The violence of the archives clearly becomes palpable in this narrative, as all we have to know of the enslaved are the inventories, the wills, and the bills of sale, alongside a limited collection of correspondence. Yet we can learn that if Maria left Robert's home, she could take her servant Edmund with her. Charity's future children and Griffin were specified as not being part of the gift to her son. If one of these individuals died, or if Maria wished to exchange them, another person of the same description would be taken and separated for Blandfield, their other plantation, to replace them. James Beverly desired a gardener for Aqualophus, but no one would accept the offered wages or work on the site in its poor condition and probably all those hills. Robert Beverly specifically sent Dick from Virginia to serve as the gardener for this landscape to elevate the garden and produce fruit, which meant he must have been quite a knowledgeable gardener. What we learn from these archives is of the labor and the violence in the lives of the enslaved, as well as the ways they lived and persisted. And I would suggest we also learn the power of place, standing on the very ground that these former residents stood, lived on, and labored. And this all connects us to the past. We look at these images, likely from the time when the Lithicums were developing their gardens, and we know that it was cultivated through the labor of enslaved gardeners who built the terraces that were created, cultivated the gardens, and maintained the orangerie. So today we recognize this long, complex history, a history that has many layers, that is braided together in complex ways that we can only begin to unbraid. Alongside that of the Blisses' contributions to the humanities and Farron's design for the landscape. We're beginning to read our landscape as one comprised of layers of history, the land as an archive. Robert Bliss, seen here with Mildred Bliss in the Rose Garden, started what we know as Dumbarton Oaks. Robert Bliss served in the State Department, ambassador to Sweden, France, and Argentina. Mildred Bliss had been a collector since childhood. I have always thought she was probably the more serious of the two as a collector. The two would begin collecting Byzantine and pre-Columbian, as well as garden documents that would eventually form one of the most extensive collections anywhere in the world. And I would say in all three of those areas, Dumbarton Oaks is known as one of the best collections. In 1921, though, just within 6 months of purchasing the property, Mildred Bliss hired Beatrix Farron, a well-established landscape architect whose first project had been a stormwater drainage project, actually for Mildred Bliss's parents in Maine. Hired her to design the gardens. Farron designed the garden, and I would note that she was actually considered in the design world what's called a prime, which meant that McKim, Mead and White, which was the architecture firm reviving the house, was actually under Farron and had to get her sign off on anything because the garden was in fact more important than the house. These are the archives that we're more familiar with. They're of the place, and they're incredibly useful, including the plant book. Farron in 1940 wrote a book about the design so that future stewards would, as she said, not freeze the garden, but cultivate and steward the garden. She was hired in 1921 when she was a well-known designer, came with significant experience, and yet this was probably one of her most famous designs, and she worked on it from 1921 to 1947. She did big drawings, she did small drawings. I'll break a long held rumor that she didn't know how to draw. She did. There are her drawings. But she would work very closely with Mildred to design the landscape and the garden, and she did all the details from the engineering of the stone walls and all the retaining walls to designing all the finials and all the gates, as well as the garden itself. What we see in the 1,347 drawings that she left to Dumbarton Oaks is we see her also working with the garden over time. You can see here the North Vista when it was surrounded by boxwoods. And then later where she's opening up, and she's actually, that's basically a model, a fake end to sort of figure it out, and then what it actually looks like today. And I think one of the interesting things is she did this French perspective, right? It comes in, so it looks farther away. But what's at the end? Anybody remember what's at the end of North Vista? The tulip poplars. Like there's no fancy French fountain. There's no Italian lady. It's the tulip poplars. Fair and integrated. And then so that I show there. So there you go. There are the tulip poplars at the end of this beautiful sort of very European bridge going out. Farron also integrated the architecture. An old cow pond became Lover's Lane Pool, the orangerie, and you can see the ficus plant there. She did an amazing job of taking what was there and working with what she was given rather than making the place match her design. The woodland and the meadows were also part of her design. It was 27 acres that would eventually become part of the National Park Service, but she designed the 18 waterfalls, small waterfalls, and the paths, et cetera, that are part of Dumbarton Oaks Park today. The entire estate would be given to Harvard in 1940 as a research center, library, and museum, in large part because they were very nervous about World War II heating up, and they were afraid DC would be bombed, and they were hoping if Dumbarton Oaks belonged to Harvard, it would be on a no-bomb list. We obviously have no way of knowing, but not a bad plan. But the collections really formed a heart of the center, housing fellows from 1941 on. And then, of course, in 1944, the Dumbarton Oaks conversations were held there. I hope I've inspired some questions and comments, as this work is not complete, but will be expanded and refined for a long time to come, hopefully long after I even leave. Understanding the complexities of any place in history is an ongoing process of research and then of sharing with our communities, and then going back to our research to refine, expand, revise, and revisit. What we are often told about places are the historical events that occurred on the place that can be mapped. But we don't adequately consider the important power of place, the role of place in the happenings, nor the ways that events change the place and the place change the events. No place holds one singular story. Land is not a stage on which history takes place. It is not a neutral site for becoming human or building community. Every place, every site is contested, complex, layered, and full of both histories and futures. Our purpose in this work and in our work with scholars is to interrogate how we might cultivate practices of placemaking, and in turn, how we might reimagine design, preservation, and conservation of places and communities as practices, as ways of thinking, and finally as a means to imagining a more truthful, full of truth, landscapes, and more beautiful future for us all. Thank you. And I am totally, do we have time for questions? I think I was okay on time. Yes, so that people online. So I'm happy to answer. And if somebody online has a question, questions, thoughts, comments. How many of you have been to Dumbarton Oaks? Who hasn't been? That's time for you to go. Yeah.
Who Hillary Clinton took to the garden of Dumbarton?
Who, say that again?
Hillary Clinton.
Oh, yes, Hillary Clinton.
Took the head of state, I think it's Afghanistan, and they discussing Dumbarton Oaks garden. Very appropriate.
Actually, you know what's interesting? I'm so glad. So that just to repeat, she was mentioning that Hillary Clinton brought many important people. In fact, Dumbarton Oaks, I'm not going to say the decade because I can't remember, but whenever they were trying to decide where to put the vice president's house before the vice president's house was established at the observatory, Dumbarton Oaks was actually on that list. I don't know that Harvard would have let that happen. That would be left to a piece of history. But it's a really important, but I think to that point that that's why I always bring up the Dumbarton Oaks conversations in 1944. So for those who don't, in 1944, the four essentially major nations, so the United Kingdom, the U.S., Russia, and China got together and wrote what would become the Charter of the United Nations. China and actually Russia, this is sort of interesting, would not meet in the same room. So they had 3 weeks of meetings with the Russians and then 3 weeks with the Chinese, and they actually came to the same agreement. I think that's pretty impressive. Some good facilitating there. But I think it really has been a place that has been engendered important conversations. And I think the garden actually, I mean, all jokes aside, obviously I'm biased toward the garden, but I actually think that garden has been as a work of art, has been a remarkable place for engendering important conversations. And I'm always surprised. And in fact, people who were at the Dumbarton Oaks conversation talk about all the, you know what, you and I need to talk, let's go walk out there. Now, part of that is you can walk in the garden and not be heard by other people, so it's private, but I think there's also something about being an exquisitely beautiful place that's also accessible, that's kind of magical. Yeah. Any other? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what the fellows do?
Yeah. Absolutely. So somebody is asking about the fellows and what they do. So what we do is we have scholars who apply, and we select a very small number, and they come and they spend either September to May or June to August, so summer fellows, academic year, and they do their scholarship. And we have Byzantine scholars, so a lot of scholars who are studying texts, and so they come, and we have a lot of the original texts they're studying, so they come to use our collection. We have pre-Columbian, we have an amazing pre-Columbian, so we have a lot of pre-Columbian scholars, and then garden and landscape studies, and then a few other programs. And what they really do is come and they do their scholarship, and they use the library, and they use the garden. And partly that piece about the garden is Mildred Bliss particularly made it clear it's part of the collection. It's not a public garden. It's in fact, she was on the fence about whether it should be open to the public, because for her, it was really about the place, a work of art that the scholars could be inspired by and do their work in, and that we would have. I think it's appropriate that we share that work of art with the public. That's why we don't do weddings. It's why you can't do photo shoots, things like that.
You don't do social things at all. Oh, interesting. But you do have concerts, right?
We do have music concerts because they were real music. In fact, for those who don't know, so we have the piano that Stravinsky came and played when he composed his Dumbarton Oak concerto for I think it was their 30th wedding anniversary. But so the scholars really come and they work. And they hear from each other. And I will say, because people are always surprised, you think Byzantine, pre-Columbian, and garden landscape, they'd have like not much to say to each other. But you'd be amazed. Every day they have lunch together every day from 12 to 1:30. And in fact, already there are all these overlaps of people going, did you know someone in Byzantine is doing like a military history, and that intersects with my history of, yeah. So the scholar, yeah, no, it's an amazing community. And they get to use the swimming pool. They do. And I have, yeah, that we have fellows who will talk about the only thing they miss the interlibrary loan and the swimming pool. And I'm always like, what about all the other, but anyway. Yeah. So it's all scholars. And I should say we have graduate students, scholars, and then we have mid-career and senior scholars. Yeah.
And how many are there right now?
I would say there are probably about 45 that are there. So I oversee a group of 15, and they're everybody from graduate students to mid-career scholars. Yeah.
Somebody online is curious about whether or not there has
Oh, what an awesome question. So I hope so. Yes, the question is whether there's been any archaeological work done at Dumbarton Oaks. And the answer is no, not yet. But Jonathan Cavalier, who I wrote all the names of the various garden superintendents here to give them credit, because gardening is a form of design. He is totally open to it. It's just a matter of doing that. I also, I'll go ahead and put it out in public. I'd love to do archaeology in the Dumbarton Oaks Park, because that has been very undisturbed and mostly soil has gathered there, not eroded away. So it would be an awesome place to, yeah, I would love. Yeah.
Based on your incredible experience and expertise, do you ever look at the garden and see an area or a feature that you maybe yourself would have done differently?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm a gardener, so I don't know how many of you garden in some way, shape, or form, right? I mean, do you go to anybody's garden and not think, oh, I like that, but I would do this. And I also have my favorite parts of the garden. No, I'm not going to tell you which ones, but I do mostly what I think about, because I'm also a historian, is I think in the stewardship of the garden, there's always the question, here's a good question. When a tree dies, a big, huge oak tree, do you just plant a new oak? Except that climate change is changing. If the new oak's not going to thrive, maybe we should plant something else. Or in the case of the bride, I don't have a picture of the bride. In the case of the bride, the magnolia, Gail Griffin, about 15 years ago, planted another one, thinking that one was going to die, right? And so she'd still have a white Yulon magnolia, except the one that was supposed to die actually looks great today, and it's sending up. So now we have two of them, and some people think we should cut down the extra one, except the moment we do that, the other one dies. So, so it's more about the evolution and how do you take care of that? How do we deal with boxwood blight? She didn't have that. And the boxwoods actually weren't a Farron introduction. Mrs. Blunt, who owned it between the Lithicums and Mildred Bliss, was a daughter of the American Revolution. And she absolutely wanted Dumbarton Oaks to look like a James River plantation. So she went down to a number of the plantations and bought huge boxwood, like 100 of them, and brought them up. And what's really sad is boxwood blight has killed probably 70% of them. And so then the question is, do we put little tiny boxwood so that in 40 years it'll look deeper? So that's mostly and I work with Jonathan a lot to talk about. Or I'll tell you one more case is a holly tree that we should have been pruning a lot sooner, and it got too big, and now it's shading something it shouldn't shade. But if we cut it way back, this tree behind it will get sunburned. So we're trying to figure out, right? So that's more what happens now. Yeah. That's more what happens now is, right? And yeah. No, and the garden book that I showed earlier is even if you're not taking care of Dumbarton Oaks, I just think it's a great example of what a designer. I teach designers and I tell them this is what they should be creating, because it's not about I planted 4 boxwood here, you should plant 4 boxwood. It's about here's what I was trying to get. This was meant as an intimate place. I wanted it to be in shade. I wanted, bright colors in the fountain terrace. She did not like bright colors, so it's the only garden where you get those hot colors. So she did that. So long-winded answer, but yeah. Any other? Anything? I'm curious. Anything that now you're going to go look for when you go to Dumbarton Oaks? Look for the trees. The tulip poplars are stunning. They're really beautiful.
There was a huge, I don't remember the name of the tree. It was a silver something
Silver maple?
that died.
Yeah.
And so what happens when something like that, you were just talking about, you're going to replace it? I mean, that was a magnificent.
That was a
tree.
magnificent, and that predated the Blisses. I mean, that was an old tree.
It was a gorgeous tree.
Yeah, it was a gorgeous tree. That was a very sad. Also, a huge beech tree died. It's been a hard couple of years. That one we are planting an elm tree there because
In that
this,
same spot.
in that same spot, because the silver maples, if any of you grow silver maples, while they can be beautiful, they drop branches willy-nilly, and they're dangerous if you have the public. And so we're planting elm trees that do this, and so they look like silver maples, but they don't drop as many branches. So that's one of those stewardship pieces of thinking about how do we create the same form and the same experience, but maybe not risk the silver maple branch dropping. Yeah.
Another question online. What would be your advice to people seeking to do similar land-oriented history work in their community? And or advice for people new to plant studies?
So say the last part.
So the first part was,
I got the first part.
and any advice you have for people new to
Plant studies. So first of all, I'll work backwards. Remember that plants have to grow in a place. So my big piece is if you're going to do plant histories, don't pretend they're up here floating in the air. Like they have to grow somewhere. They have to grow in soil. So just if you're going to study plants, I want you to study where they grow. Like what do they do when they're in the places, or where do we try to grow them? But so that's part of the plant piece. But the real way, how do you do history? How do you start? I would say the same way I did, which is I work backwards. The easiest histories to do are property. You go look at deeds, right? And you trace who, and then you start looking at newspapers, and then you start digging, and then you start asking questions. And then I would say the really important piece is you start sharing it with people, because invariably somebody will say, oh, I know where that is, or I have information on this. So my big piece is, just start where you can. We looked at census records. Those are great, and they're all online, which is awesome. They're also agricultural census. So just start with what you can. There's so much online, especially in this area. So start there and then share so that other people, it's why we got together with Tudor Place and Georgetown University and the Female Union Band Cemetery. And who's the other? Tudor Place, Georgetown. Oh, and Holy Trinity, because we were all doing our history and then sharing it. We were like, oh, you have that archive, or you can show me, or that you have more information on this family. And if we hadn't shared, we wouldn't know. We'd all be trying to find the same thing. That makes sense? All right, thank you. Thank you for listening. And come visit the gardens.